we started working on the smart building at the Museum of London Docklands because we wanted to get our hands dirty on a smart building. And this was the perfect place where we can experiment and then transfer everything that we learned from this process into our new museum, which is currently in construction. So we put in the infrastructure and we engaged the facility management team, and we started to discuss benefits with senior management, and we shared the data with some research organizations, universities, and we really got as much into the market as we possibly could, learn as much as we could. And then all of those learnings from the work that we did at the Museum of London Docklands transferred directly into the new project at Smithfield.
Hey friends, if you like the Nexus podcast, the best way to continue the learning is to join our community. There are 3 ways to do that. First, you can join the Nexus Pro membership. It's our global community of smart building professionals. We have monthly events, paywall deep dive content, and a private chat room, and it's just $35 a month. Second, you can upgrade from the Pro membership to our courses offering. It's headlined by our flagship course, The Smart Building Strategist, and we're building a catalog of courses taught by world-leading experts on each topic under the Smart Buildings umbrella. Third, and finally, our marketplace is how we connect leading vendors with buyers looking for their solutions. The links are below in the show notes, and now let's go on to the podcast. Welcome to the Nexus podcast. This is the latest episode in our series diving into case studies of real-life, large-scale deployments of smart building technologies. And I emphasize real life because we're not here to create a fluff story. We're here to share real lessons from leaders so that others can put this to use in their smart buildings programs. Today, our story is coming out of the Museum of London, which currently has 2 locations, one of which is in the process of moving sites and with plans to reopen in stages starting in 2026. The new museum will be a world-leading smart museum using the latest technology and data science to minimize energy use and the day-to-day operations. So the voice you heard at the beginning was Steve Watson, technical building lead at the Museum of London. Steve, can you introduce yourself and tell us about your background, please?
Hi, James. Thanks for inviting me on. So I'm originally from Melbourne. I've been in the UK for the last 15 years, and my career has been spent working on either cultural institutions or in corporate businesses, and I tend to switch back and forth. But I've been lucky enough to work on some amazing buildings, the Royal Academy of Arts in Piccadilly, and then in Melbourne at the National Arts Centre and also the Performing Arts Centre in Melbourne. I started my career as an electrician, so I've worked on site, then went into project work. I've worked as both a client and a contractor, also in facilities management, and again, worked on both sides of the fence, so facilities management. And that's, over 30 years of experience in buildings. So I find myself in the smart buildings world now, because I see that as the solution to a lot of problems and a lot of things that people have to overcome when having to deliver or meet the expectations of building owners and building occupiers.
Totally. That perspective from both sides of the fence is super important in a role like yours. It's interesting how you've worked in these cultural institutions throughout your career. I'm wondering what excites you about these types of buildings.
They're quite often the some of the highlight buildings in a city, or you get to work with some really beautiful buildings, and you get to mix with some really interesting creative people. The Royal Academy of Arts, for example, has most of the heavyweight architects in the UK as members. And you get to rub shoulders with some pretty talented people within the buildings environment. I think, like the preservation of old buildings, but with new technology is something I've always loved. I like the idea of old cars with new technology in them as well. And same with buildings. And I think that's, key to the preservation and the sustainability of the older stock of buildings going forwards.
Awesome. That's super cool. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a little project overview, case study, if you will, around one building that you guys are making smart, like you said, sort of exploring. And then we're going to use that to talk about how it's influencing the decisions on the new building. So for the project that you've already done, can you talk about who your vendor team is? How many buildings are we talking about? How big is the building? And when did this start? And what have been your sort of high level results on this? Just kind of give us a quick overview of the project.
Yeah, sure. So the Museum of London Docklands is 129,000 square feet. It's open to the public museum, and I started working on that probably 4-5 years ago. Was the initial discussions with a company called OneSite Solutions. They're a master systems integrator and a BMS technology vendor in London, and then through them started working with Buildings IoT. And together we've worked through the challenges of understanding the BMS data, or I suppose we've addressed a lot of the challenges which a lot of existing buildings face now, and that is the data problem and how to get over that to make the value of data available.
Cool. Yeah, and I just realized for my next London trip, I'm going to have to come over. I like to come over to London to watch soccer or football for you guys, but I'm going to have to add the museum to my next trip.
Absolutely. Let me know.
So we also have Jason Pohl here, who's Customer Success Manager at Buildings IoT. Welcome, Jason. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, James. So I'm with Buildings IoT, and fundamentally, my job is just to help the customers get the value and utilization that they expect out of the software that we deploy with them, right? So I might reach back into implementation or project work to help speed things along, but the core focus in my day-to-day work with folks like Steve is really just supporting them in the kind of human change management, I like to call it, where you have some new tools, some new data available to you, and you're going through the transformation process of integrating those into your facility operations there. So I've spent a couple years now doing this type of work, but also I have some IT background and spent a little bit of time in the military as well. So I think just working in different environments in corporate real estate or with vendors and understanding how people work really has been instrumental in being able to be effective in supporting folks like Steve when they're going through a project like we have been engaged with on them at the Docklands Museum there.
Yeah, totally. And just to be clear and clarify this in my mind, you guys are a US-based software company. You partner with master systems integrators in the UK on projects like these to actually be your sort of boots on the ground support. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. We do have a couple folks in the UK, recently opened an office in Leeds, but fundamentally we're having our US-based team do some of the onboarding work, but we've got tremendous partners like OneSite Solutions that are doing that groundwork for us.
Makes sense. All right, let's tell the story of this program in a little more detail here. So Steve, can you talk about why you started down this path and sort of what your goals were? And I'll caveat this with we did sort of overview article on our website about this project, and Natalie, who wrote it from the Buildings IoT side, she said Steve loves data, and I thought that was a funny thing to say about someone that's sort of running a facility. Can you talk about what she meant by that, why you love data, and sort of, you mentioned a couple minutes ago the data problem. So can you talk about why you started down this path and sort of what the data problem is?
So the data problem has always been there, and that is that over time that there's rarely enough governance in a building to maintain good quality data of building data, and so it degrades over time. But I'm very focused on the changing relationship that we have with data now, And the way we use our mobile phones to count our steps or to suggest a travel route or even to record historical data like taking photos, that's changed in the last 10 to 15 years with smartphones. So the same thing I think is happening in buildings now, where we know that there's a lot of data generated by the engineering systems in the building, and we're hungry for that data. So Steve loves data means I want that data, and I want it to be in a format that that I can do things with. And it's not just me, like I can sense the excitement amongst computer science students who do not have domain knowledge, but who can quickly understand the basics of how a building works and want to work with the data. And they feed back to me the issues with the data as well. Initially, what does this abbreviation mean? What's the naming structure? Is there a naming structure? And so, I think those are the data problems that we can solve and that we're working on.
Yeah, it seems like sometimes so much of it is just getting it in a format that computer science folks or people that are going to do stuff with it, the format that they expect to see, right? And so much of OT data is not in any format that someone can do something with and that they expect to see. So when I think of a museum, the projects I've done in museums in the past, energy audits and retrofits and those types of things, I think about the constant temperature and humidity requirements. Can you talk about sort of the more technical aspects of the day-to-day operation of the facility?
Yes, so there's a couple of situations. One is where you've got your own collection and you need to keep that in a stable environment. There's normally a conservation team in a museum and a collections team and an exhibition team, and all of them are focused on keeping a stable environment, which means a steady relative humidity and a steady temperature. Over recent years, those conditions have relaxed a little bit, which is great, which means that it's not as energy intensive. But like quite often, there's a lot of art stored in old salt mines where the conditions are absolutely perfect. And air conditioning is in a museum and gallery is one of the biggest expenses, so not just on the energy it consumes, but on the maintenance and the replacement costs of that equipment. The importance of air conditioning is tied to the preservation of the objects, and we preserve the objects because we use them to tell stories, and that's what we do in the museum. We tell stories. In our case, it's about London, and it's for Londoners and visitors. That's the purpose of maintaining the close control conditions.
Awesome. So let's talk about the technology piece. So when you guys think about your technology stack now versus what it was like before, can you talk about what that was before and like what were the problems with that? From, we talked about the data piece, but what beyond data, what were the problems with it?
Yeah. So I know Steve has at the museum the existing BMS, and there was another long-term data store where a lot of the energy meter data was stored. And then, of course, you'll have your lighting and the sensor data as well. So I think one of the things that was interesting that we were able to help solve for him is just bringing those all under one API and one front end and making it a little easier, proving that on the long term, preserving the data quality, can be done in a kind of more regimented way where it's not one place for your energy data, one place for your VMS data, but a place where those two things are married together and you're trending it all, and it's going to be available for, as Steve mentioned, some research students, right? Or to pull from if he has some consultants. We've added some consultants that he has working together with him into the platform so that they can go in and easily look at the data themselves there, right? So previously, maybe where that information is at is not easily accessible, right? So just one of the standard benefits of SaaS and a cloud platform is that he wants to add a couple of users to look at the various things that we have connected. That's a straightforward process. and it will all be there, with the relationships as well. So that's the main thing that comes to mind with kind of where he was at and where we've got to today.
Yeah, and if I can just summarize what both of you have kind of said, all of these different systems were not connected in any way. So if you had data in one and data in the other, there's no way to sort of bring that together, no easy way to bring that together. So you mentioned metering, you mentioned HVAC, you mentioned lighting control, and just all the different ways in which that data can exist in all those different systems. You're bringing it into one place, modeling the data, and then allowing it to be used through various different ways. So Steve, you've been around the industry for, you said 30 years. You've been on the vendor side as well. You were probably exposed to a lot of different ways to solve this problem, right? There's a lot of vendors out there. Can you talk about what options you were considering and sort of why you made the selection you did in terms of working with Buildings IoT and sort of choosing the way that they do things from a software perspective?
Like the two things that I find really, really important is the relationship with the company, and in this case with Jason, to be able to work with someone. And the other thing that I find really important is the interface. So this is not even getting into the back end or the technical side of things, but those two, the interface is super important first, because if it's not likable, then you've already got a problem, And I think as consumers of data now, we're becoming more and more picky. Actually, we want I'd love my relationship to building data to be same as my relationship to, say, retail data and apps. That I get. I don't think we're quite there yet. But looking at the interface that Buildings IoT provided, and the ease of which I was able to pull data together, like disparate data together, was super important. And then it's all about the relationship. And like I said earlier, if we're going to create something, we need to get onto a level where we understand each other and we are creative. We can see a vision of the future and we work together to build that. I think that's really, really important.
Absolutely. No, that's great. And so as you guys think about the project and the journey you're on, can you talk about the main phases of this deployment? So what we've heard so far, right, is that there's an existing building you're upgrading digitally. There's a new building coming online. Can you talk about the ways in which you've sort of gone through this process from deciding to move forward to where you're at today?
First thing was, I realized that our BMS data in the Museum of London Docklands wasn't up to scratch and wasn't really usable. So at the same time, we were working with Arup, who are the engineering design consultants on the major project. And we developed a naming convention. We used their naming convention and, modified it a little bit. We also linked it to the BDNS, and we came up with a naming convention that we would use for both the prototype and the new building. So that synergy set us off down a data renaming route, and then that was an important part. And then the next phase was to work with OneSite Solutions. So installing the infrastructure. So we had to get controllers. So Trend controllers had to get, or Honeywell controllers. They still were working on their own LAN, some of them. So a lot of that got moved over to IP. We installed an instance of Niagara. And I think it was around about that point that we started working with OneSite Solutions. And they prepared the data, I think, initially to go to an MQTT broker. And I'm not sure if Jason, if you're getting the data natively out of Niagara or whether you get it via the broker.
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually are grabbing it straight out of Niagara in this instance, but also we do have something that is we've been working on is we can configure a broker and get it out that way as well. But in this particular case, right, we have where Steve just described the incredibly important prerequisite work that happens before a solution like ours can be set up. once you have a decent amount of good quality data, right, we can't just come in and do that basic driver integration, or as a more future looking way, use the MQTT framework there and bring it out into our cloud so that we can just have a very light touch in the BMS. Like, that's a hugely important theme for most of our customers that come to us, is they're not always owning or supporting the BMS, right? So we just want to very simply get the data into our cloud so that we can then do the normalization and integration and apply all the features that are going to show up on the front end there. So I think with the folks at one side, they did really a lot of the hard work, the light work of preparing the building for us to come in and do the integration and the normalization aspects of it. And once we got into that in earnest, that bi-directional communication with them, where it's not a traditional kind of vendor-customer relationship, but a true partnership in the sense that there was some stuff there that was existing that needed a little bit of tweaking. They helped us get that solved. So when we go turn on the fault detection diagnostics, we can have faith that they're valid, right, on good, clean data there.
Awesome. Oh, the themes I'm hearing really align with what we try to educate buyers and the market around is what you're talking about, is like getting your different layers of the stack solidified before you start to add on software. So what we've talked about is the device layer, all your different systems. We've talked about getting the network layer, right, Steve? You talked about getting them onto IP. Jason and Steve, you talked about the data layer and getting all the data normalized and available in the cloud. This sort of pattern you guys are talking about is a very standard one, and one that I feel like keeps coming up in every smart building story, right? Is we have to get those three layers of the infrastructure right before we start to talk about what can we do with the data and any sort of software application that comes next. That being said, I'd love to talk about the software piece next. So one of the things that you guys have done here is, Jason, you talked about FTD a few times. You're doing FTD, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it sounds like there's also kind of like a visualization layer, and you're allowing the users and operators and Steve to sort of explore the data on 3D floor plans of the museum. Can you talk about that piece?
Yeah, absolutely. So we really deliver OnPoint in two distinct manners. One is you just come in, you get some analytics, you want the data layer from our API. And the other is what Steve has, where we're going to deliver that, but also provide some more traditional BMS functions of it's a floor plan. And then we integrate the relationships that we model into that, right? So he goes to the floor plan, says the room number, he clicks on that area of the museum and it says it's this piece of equipment and it's serving these rooms. And then he can click on a relationships tab. It says, hey, this piece of equipment is getting water from the condenser water plant, and maybe the air handler is serving some terminal units, right? So the marrying of those two things definitely is tremendously valuable when you are going through this transformation process that Steve is. So you might have folks looking at it that are used to a BMS, right? So not just providing some traditional table views, right? But having that with your analytics and the spatial modeling overlaying on a floor plan really eases the transition of someone who might not be used to looking at a piece of software that's providing you very specific guidance on the data that we're integrated in. So it's exciting because that's not always a scenario that is possible given everybody is a snowflake paradigm, right? It's good when there's someone like Steve that's able to procure a solution that can provide that functionality to ease that transition. And Steve, if you got any other color to add to that?
Yeah, I just think, that when we're talking about the engineers who have to run the building, they need the information as easily as possible, and they need to trust the information. They need to have the information in a way that they can interpret and make decisions on. And I think that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get accurate information or accurate analysis to the engineers in the best way possible for them to act on.
Love that. Okay, let's talk about FDD next. So when I think about what you guys just shared, it's like taking the software layer of your BMS and making it a little bit superpowered by the data model and the ability to have these relationships built in and those types of things. FDD really takes it up to the next level of something that typically the BMS is not going to provide. The engineers and operators running the building probably aren't used to that level of analysis of the data. So can you guys talk about like what FDD means and sort of what some of the results have been there?
Absolutely. So I'll tee you up, Steve, for this one. So for us, when the majority of our customers, of course, including Steve, are coming and saying we want analytics running on top of it. And one of the things that is a huge part of just the normal customer success workflow is helping folks looking at that for the first time and identifying what their immediate next steps are when they log in and they see, hey, I have a fan status command mismatch, or there's some pumps running on the plant that aren't supposed to be, or even something as simple as, hey, the value on your sensor that's battery powered has been stuck for a number of hours. Like, take a peek at it. Maybe you need a new battery, right? And going from this is an alarm on the BMS, you have to react immediately to, you have this information that's based off of the historical data, and you can organize your workflow a little bit around that. And that's, the beginning part of this overall journey that Steve's on, right? So this is the existing building, and he's understanding how he's going to be able to take this transformation and apply it to the new construction, right? Because it's not just technology. Like, I love talking about how analytics work and the power they can provide, but ultimately the software is as good as the people using it. And it's really a joy in my day-to-day work to see folks understand how they can change their workflow, make it a little easier, and just reduce that learning curve that any new tool will incur when you are just changing how things have always been done. So we're very much in the beginning of that journey, and it's good. And one of the things that Steve and his team have done very well is understand that you want to get started on that as early as possible. We really can't understate the value of just getting started. Your 500,000 or however many square feet your new museum is going to be when it opens, that's not when you want to be touching new technology for the first time, right? You want to have a couple reps under your belt there. So, Steve, what else might I have missed in that kind of general recap that you want to add some additional color to?
Not much. I think that was pretty thorough. But one thing I would say is that I think with a traditional BMS, I don't think fault detection and diagnosis was ever done very well. Certainly you got a lot of alarms, but you didn't get a sentence with it, or you didn't get a suggestion of what might be wrong, and that's next level. The other thing which is really important for us is that identifying a fault doesn't fix the fault necessarily, and working with Jason and a company called Flowpath, who are also based in the States, they were using their CMMS system. They've created an API so that the insights, that the analysis that gets performed in OnPoint is transformed into work orders in the work order system. And of course, at the start of when we connect, we get this big backlog of issues that we work through. But as we clear that, we're starting to see real insights turn into real work orders, and someone complete that work order and closing the loop. And that's super exciting.
Yeah, super exciting. You're preempting the questions I was going to have. So can you guys talk about, was the CMMS, or I forget what you guys call it in the UK, CAFM, was that in place already, or was Flowpath a new vendor as well? And so you guys had to figure out, how do we implement this new software and integrate it with the faults? Can you talk about that sort of transition?
Flowpath was actually recommended through discussions with Jason, and I don't think you're too far away from each other geographically. And then I got in touch with those guys, and we talked through their product and how they work. And it's a really good interface, really, really great. Another great company, another company that focus on relationship management, which is super important. And they feel like they're at the beginning of a great journey. And that's the kind of people we want to work with. That's the non-technical side.
Yeah. And I mean, just full disclosure, we hadn't worked with FlowPath before, right? Steve came to me and he said, hey, I want to have an integration. Do you have any suggestions? Right. I said, hey, well, we have this one integration that's built. There's this other company that they're, like you said, geographically nearby in Atlanta. I've talked with them. They seem like they align with how we do business and what you're trying to achieve. Just have a chat with them, see if it's useful, right? And once he had that initial chat, I just, again, talked with the technical folks at FlowPath and set them up with an API account. And this is the most exciting technical bit for me is they just built the integration right into our API. We didn't have to build anything for them, right? And the way that it was structured, it was a pretty straightforward process for them. And, gives Steve the same experience that he was describing with OnPoint. It's a very modern front end, and it's able to work through the steps that he needs. I think you talked about like being able to assign to different contractors, right? Or even just kind of creating a simple URL that someone can go to and see what the work order is. So that was not something that we planned, right? We had our scope for the analytics and having some BMS and some visualization platform. And then after we got through that, Steve said, hey, what about integration into a work order system? And I think it's one of the kind of key values we can provide, just how we deliver the product is we don't have to build everything for our customers, right? We're going to make your data available. And if you want to have another vendor come in and do an integration for something, by all means, have a chat with them and we can set them up and they can be on their way.
Absolutely. So those are the sort of big things that you guys are doing with the data at the what we call the application layer. So Steve, can you talk about the lessons learned here? And what I mean by that is what has happened on this project from a results perspective that you will then apply to the new building that's coming online in a couple of years?
The main thing that I want to carry forward into the new building is that we need to work with the right companies. And at the same time, we need to own our data and be market aware. I'm expecting big things from the smart buildings sector over the next 5 years. And, we'll be involved in everything that happens and we want to know about that. The way we're working through the technical submissions process on the new project means that we're looking at the data that the technology, like a fan call unit, for example, the data that is going to be exposed, and we're doing that much earlier in the project than you would normally do that. And we're looking at what data is going to get exposed. Is it going to the BMS or is it an IP device? If it's an IP device, all of that has come way forward in the project. So we're kind of getting in the weeds earlier in the project, and it's really good. It's super good. We're getting into it, before the trade contractor arrives on site with equipment that does or doesn't do things that we're not aware of.
Yeah, I think I'll just echo that this is something that we've seen across other customers as well, right? Especially when we are engaging on some MSI work stateside where it is a new construction, right? And there's a consulting process of, hey, here's the overall timeline on this new build, and here's what our outcomes are, right? Thinking about, hey, they've got Div 25 and I know exactly what they're looking for. Tell me what I need to be aware of so that I don't get to a point where a systems integrator is coming in and putting a device online and we identify, oh, that network is not connected to the network that it needs to get other data from, right? So if you are, as the example Steve provided, like the fan coil unit, right? We know what we expect to see from an FCU, and it's pretty well known. I think at this point we have this ontology alignment project. It's open. We can go and see how we would tag that piece of equipment and what the data is available. And just being able to point to that for folks in a construction process to say, hey, yeah, we know it's probably too early to maybe define the exact point list, but you can point to this and say, this is what we're generally expecting, and we're going to run analytics on it. And that can not always happen before submittals, especially when you're having things come from the design engineer and all the information isn't known, but they can choose the right equipment so that you're not having as many revisions through that process or having a gap, right? It's definitely something that we always love to see, where you have a new construction project or even just a substantial retrofit, and they're asking these questions early enough in the process so that they're not engaging a software vendor to do analytics at a point where we come in, take a peek under the hood and say, well, there's not a lot of great analytics that we can do because the data is not there, right? So it's a you don't know what you don't know scenario, right? And going through the process at the Docklands Museum, seeing what data he has on those existing pieces of equipment, I think is what Steve is describing and informing, hey, this is what we're expecting on these new equipment as well.
Yeah, I can't even summarize how many projects I've worked on where you get to the point where it's too late and you realize you don't have the data that you expected. Let's talk about, we said at the outset of this that we would share sort of some lessons learned and challenges with implementing this approach. I feel like you guys have said the word journey several times, talked about this as a learning experience so that you can apply it in the future. So let's not act like this has been easy, right? So let's share some sort of challenges. So let's maybe go through 1, 2, 3 challenges so that people can get a sense of the sort of obstacles that you had to overcome and whatever advice you'd have for other people as they sort of encounter those.
For sure. All right, Steve, I'm going to tee you up on the first one here. So we definitely touched on the data quality aspect a lot. I think what's not always said is you may have really competent, qualified people, you're engaged in scope to deliver this project, but they're going to come in and something else has already been done, right? So thinking about the pieces of equipment in the BMS, there were controller upgrades, right? And there's some assumptions made through that process to get that data into the new Niagara system, right? And it's not always anyone's fault that some data is mapped wrong that is currently engaged on the project, right? So we had to do some fixes out there, and it wasn't anything that we did wrong or anything that one side did wrong or Steve provided bad documentation. It was no fault of anyone that was engaged in the project, right? But having the right folks, to hark back to that point Steve was making earlier, involved means that we could actually go through the work to solve it, right? And go in and remap some stuff in the BMS where that's not always possible. And it's always going to be a little messy when you're connecting into systems that are existing, especially if they're existing and they were upgraded to a new IP controller, but maybe during that process, it didn't include a full field verification of everything that you're seeing on those controllers there. So, Steve, what else can you add on that aspect for me?
Well, I think it's just the point is about getting started, isn't it? And getting to those issues as quickly as possible and working through them. Yeah, I mean, you have to get started and not expect things to be easy or perfect, but then working through it with the understanding that every hurdle is an opportunity to get closer to what we want.
All right, what other challenges did you experience?
The relationships that form during the process of building the smart infrastructure and working with vendors is super important. And, I think that we're still working together because it's been a success. So, I think that's something that we're constantly evaluating and it's making the right decisions there. Are very, very important.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, Steve, just finding the right people is the challenge, right? Because it's not necessarily before you even get to selecting the technology, right? It's like the people, and we just happen to be the folks in this scenario that can support the work that you need to do to get to the cool guy shiny widget stuff at the end of the road there. And I think that's something that we've seen in this smart building, and it's especially the contracting space, for a long time, right? It's like relationships still drive a lot of business, right? And on the technical side, for me, it drives the success of a project where you are connecting to things that you didn't install, right? And you're modeling data that you didn't initially integrate from the field. And that truly collaborative process is not always for the faint of heart, right? When you get your hands on some data that is needing a couple extra hours of cleansing, you really got to be invested in the customer's outcome to do that, right? Because some people can raise the change order flag and say, this wasn't in scope, right? But I think we really had folks that rolled up their sleeves and just helped us get to the eventual outcome of having some good data there that we can do something with.
Makes a ton of sense. Steve, can you talk a little bit about the sort of the financial side of this, the business case for investing in another layer of software, or in this case, data layer and application layer in your stack? So, typically, if you think about the museum's budget before, you had a BMS budget and lighting control budget, et cetera, and now you're adding on these different software layers. How do you think about paying for it? And was that a challenge in sort of making that business case?
It's always a challenge, and you always need to be able to articulate it. I was actually surprised that it's not as expensive as you might think. To set up the BMS data and the meter data on our infrastructure, to buy an instance of Niagara, to pay for the time for people to work with the data, it's not a very expensive exercise at all, and the value that we get out of it. We can save ourselves the money through preventative maintenance and through the insights, I know it's difficult for you to put that business case down on paper. Anyone who's been in the industry long enough knows the feeling of the dread of a big piece of equipment going down, that you really know you perhaps could have known, or you could have done something to do beforehand.
No, I mean, just understanding how you, as the buyer and decision maker, think about this is awesome. So let's think about others that are like you out there, Steve, that are listening to this. If you had to give them a roadmap or a playbook, what would the steps be that you would tell them to go through to sort of copy this approach?
I think I'd advise them to build a prototype. Start small, get an instance of Niagara. They have to engage with the smart building community, and they really need to engage with data science. I guess I started listening to Data Skeptic in 2018 or something like that, and your episodes as well, James, around 2020 or something like that. And I always said to people, you need to be listening to one podcast a week at least, and a book a month. From a client's perspective, they really need to get educated so they can have decent conversations. And I don't think the technical side of it, although it can be laborious, I don't think it's overly difficult. There's plenty of skilled people around who can do with it, as long as you work together and you're able to have a meeting of minds, I guess, over what the vision is and where you want to get to.
Yeah, so if I'm hearing you correctly, the answer to the playbook is to engage with the Nexus podcast and the Nexus community. That's a selfish interpretation of what you just said, but yeah, I got you.
I heard the same thing, James.
Yeah, Jason, what would you say in terms of like talking to other buyers out there about following this path?
I think I can't understate the willingness that Steve has to just get started and be curious about the process, right? Many times when you are thinking about doing something for the first time, just the thought of getting started is overwhelming, right? But once you get started, it's actually almost always not as bad as you imagine. And for the Museum of London team, there's what I've picked up through this process is the organization is, mature in a way that Steve's empowered to make these decisions, to say, hey, let's actually try this. We don't know exactly how it's going to end up, but we know it's going to be worth it. We're going to learn a lot on the way. And the first step is not to always go out and find the software, but to have the conversations with your stakeholders internally, to get a little buy-in, to say, hey, I want to try something new. I think I have a general idea on how it's going to work, but I really won't know until we start. And that is easier said than done, right? And for folks that have gone through it, and I've gone through different portions of my career where somebody reached out and said, this is what you should be doing, and they didn't have to help me. And just building a little bit of a network and not being afraid to reach out and say, hey, can you help me do this? I think people that have gone through a transformation, they're always eager to help the next person. If they have experienced the pain, they don't want the next guy to have to learn the same lessons, right? So really, find a community that can help you through that process. And, we've, like the Building Intelligence group, they have a lot of chapters everywhere, right? There's one here in Atlanta, and we do that where it's just, we want to get together once a month or something, talk about what's working, what's not working, and that FaceTime with other folks that are going through the same thing can really give you a light bulb moment of, okay, I know what I need to do differently to really get to a new outcome there.
Totally. Yeah, I'm hearing a couple things from you guys. One is we like to say the role of the smart building champion. So Steve, having that role that's internal to the organization, willing to sort of shepherd or whatever metaphor you want to use, bring forward the smart buildings program within the organization. That's how we teach it in our course. We kind of think of our course as like creating smart building champions. But there's some free content out there for anyone that's looking to figure out what that role looks like, and we'll link to those in the show notes. The other thing I'm hearing from you guys is the value of finding software providers like Buildings IoT that are not just software providers, right? It sounds like the partnership and the ability to sort of walk you through that as an external voice as well. Anything I'm missing, you guys, that we haven't covered that you think would be good for the audience to hear before we take off?
The only thing I would suggest is that there's a really large community of researchers working in this field as well, in the universities, and there's some great stuff coming. There's some really good stuff coming using large language models and using natural language interfaces into building data, and I can't wait for it.
Yeah, I think we've hit on everything that I really just have learned and wanted to share through this whole process. And the only thing that I can think to add on top of it really is just that, as you go through a process or you're trying to identify what it is that you need to do to get started, is just start with the outcomes, right? Like, what is it that you want to achieve? And don't go too wide, right? Choose one or two things you're really trying to achieve, and then go through a process, find partners and products that can help you achieve that, and then build upon it once you get that first outcome out of the way there. It can be easy to say, I want FTD and automated control, and I want an API that has all my data available, right? And those are all cool things that I love doing, but if you just choose one, it's a lot easier to get started.
That's great advice. And that's one of the things we're trying to do with this case study series, is really show what else is everyone out there doing, and then what are the obstacles to getting there, to allow others to sort of visualize themselves going through the same process. So thank you both for coming on the show and sharing this journey with us. And maybe you'll come back after the new building is built and we can talk about what it was like on the construction process.
Okay, friends, thank you for listening to this episode. As we continue to grow our global community of changemakers, we need your help. For the next couple of months, we're challenging our listeners to share a link to their favorite Nexus episode on LinkedIn with a short post about why you listen. It would really, really help us out. Make sure to tag us in the post so we can see it. Have a good one.